Hi, my name's Scott Malcomson. I'm a visiting media fellow at the Carnegie Corporation, an international security fellow at New America, and the author of SplinterNet. I'm here today to have a conversation with Adam Segal in the hallway of the Carnegie Corporation. Adam is the czar of internet-related things at the Council on Foreign Relations here in New York. He's the author of 3 books. The most recent one, The Hacked World Order, is a wonderful book about geopolitics and the web, and a must-read, and recently reviewed in the Carnegie Reporter behind me. He is at ADS China on Twitter, which is an absolutely great source every day for information both on China and on the internet. And that brings me to the other great quality that Adam has, which is before he went into internet work, he was an expert on China, has fluent Mandarin, spent a lot of time in China. And so one of the things that's been missing often in commentary on and analysis of politics and the internet is the politics side, and particularly the geopolitics side. So Adam brings a unique set of expertise to these topics and to the topic of cybersecurity, which is our subject today. Adam, I want to start by just sort of establishing a point that I think gets neglected sometimes, that in discussions of cyber warfare and cyber espionage, that they're two easily distinguished things, whereas generally speaking, they both have to do with the same fundamental activity of network penetration, that if you want to spy or if you want to undertake some form of cyber aggression, usually you need to penetrate the enemy's network by the same means, whether you're spying or you have something, as they say, more kinetic in mind. So is there a meaningful line between cyber warfare and cyber espionage from a technical point of view, or is it something that really needs to be imposed from a political point of view?
Right, you see an attacker in your network. Are they there to collect information, or are they there to prepare the battlefield, right? Are they mapping the networks? Are they going to leave some type of code behind that can be activated? So from the defender's point of view, you're not necessarily going to know what they're doing there. And I think, you point to, I think, 2 problems. One is that the language is often so vague for this, right? Cyber attack, cyber war, cyber spying, all mean different things. And then from a policy perspective, what are we trying to prevent, right? We know that there's lots of spying going on. We'll probably never be able to stop that. We probably want to stop certain types of attacks, but how do you do that given the technical issue that you raised about we can't keep people out of networks?
Well, and the other big technical issue is that once you're in a network, somebody else has to find you. And if you have a weapon embedded, the last thing you want to do, usually the last thing you want to do, is to let the enemy know that it's there, because then they can locate it, they can figure out what it is, and they can neutralize it. So unlike a lot of other weapons, cyber weapons sort of are inherently secret until they're used, whereas any kind of, among other things, any model of deterrence depends on the other side knowing what you have, but whereas with cyber you tend to not tell them. Or the American tactic recently has been to say, we do have lots of scary weapons, but we won't actually say what they are, which is a different variation.
Yeah, and I think that's, again, so we have this problem about how do you demonstrate cyber capacity, right? How do you convince the other side that you are a powerful cyber power? And as you said, you don't tell the other side, oh, we have the capacity to take down your power grid, because then they go patch all of their networks around the power grid, and you don't have that capacity any longer. As you said, we've said, the United States has said, we're going to conduct cyber operations against the Islamic State. But what those are, we don't know yet. And the one operation that's been attributed to the United States and Israel, Stuxnet, right? The use of malware to disrupt the centrifuges at Natanz and slow down the Iranian nuclear program. Well, the U.S. has never officially claimed it of its own, and you couldn't do that type of attack again. Everyone knows that you have to patch certain systems. So it's not like nuclear war, right? You can't march your weapons in a big parade. You can't detonate a missile and let the other side know how strong you are.
Who are the main cyber powers? Because it's not the same as it overlaps with, but is not the same as nuclear powers or other powers.
Yeah, I think one of the assumptions we had about digital cyber weapons was that it was going to cause this tremendous diffusion of power, right? And that the individual hacker was going to be as strong as the nation state. And that hasn't happened, right? I think, as you said, there is some pretty clear overlap between traditional, conventional military power and cyber power, right? Because you have to have, it's not just being able to hack, you also have to have conventional intelligence capabilities and other things. So, you know, we know the US is very capable, we know clearly Russia is very capable. China, the UK, Germany, Israel, France, probably South Korea, Taiwan, those are all ones we can probably see. What will probably change over time is we will see some diffusion because a lot of these capabilities are being bought and sold on black markets. There are very capable individual hackers. Some of them are criminals, some of them are hacktivists. And so we have seen some proliferation of those capabilities. And if you're a small country and you want to do a fairly low-level cyber attack, you can probably buy that on the market.
So let's talk about small countries a little bit. Given that there's a limited number of major cyber powers, and even with diffusion, it's probably likely to stay relatively small, not for lack of ambition among smaller powers, but just because the kind of, firstly, the innovative framework that you need in order, you can't just develop a cyber weapon, you have to continually develop, leading edge cyber weapons. Like with any other weapon, the old ones become not so valuable. And so the sort of politico-economic ecosystem you need to be a cyber power is not going to be shared by all 193 member states of the United Nations. And so at that point, what do you think will happen to alliances? I'm really interested in the question of is it even logical to draw the metaphor this far, but does it make sense to imagine a world where you have a certain number of cyber powers, great powers, so to speak, and for smaller countries, the rational or the path of least resistance will be to ally themselves with one or another, or if, as you say, because so many of these capabilities are available at some point privately, that it would not lead to cyber alliances so much as it would lead to spending programs in smaller countries that could afford it.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. I think what we've seen is already the great powers, or at least some U.S. allies, there's a complementary there, and we work very closely, right? So we can tell from the revelations of the NSA contractor Edward Snowden that the U.S. works very closely with the U.K. In this space, and the NSA in particular has a very close relationship with GCHQ, the British intelligence agency. And that comes from the long history coming from World War II. And Britain has capabilities in encryption and cryptography that really complement the United States. I think you see the other story in the NATO alliance, where the U.S. has been pushing NATO to take a more forward-leaning position on cyber weapons and the use of cyber weapons. But other than the UK and France and Germany, those countries, the rest of the countries don't really have cyber weapon capabilities, and they don't know very much about the United States. At one point they were complaining that the US Cyber Command had never briefed them about what their capabilities were. So I think what they'll do is continue the alliance tightly on the conventional side. They will buy and develop their own capabilities. We haven't seen very close integration on the operational level on the alliance side.
I'm Scott Malcomson, in conversation with Adam Segal here at the Carnegie Corporation. Adam is at Council on Foreign Relations and tweets at ADS China on internet and China-related issues. When you say that the U.S. wanted them to wanted NATO to lean forward more, and the leading NATO allies to lean forward more on cybersecurity issues, while at the same time, as you say, the U.S. did not want to share, like any other cyber power, doesn't want to share what it is that its capabilities are. What does that mean for them to lean forward more, develop more things, and then share them with the U.S.? Or what would
I
it
think
amount to?
they wanted to lean forward on a policy way, right? Because basically the U.S. has been trying to shape the international rules for cyberspace. And one of the big questions ever since 2007, when it appears to be Russia-based hackers attacked Estonia, a member of NATO, was the question about when does a cyber attack become an act of war, right? Which is a very important question for NATO, right? Because if it's an act of war, or use of force, or an armed attack, then you can invoke Article 5, right? Which is the responsibility of the allies to come to the defense. But in cyber, there's been no agreed upon definition about that. And for a long time, NATO basically said, well, we think cyber will be disruptive, but we don't think it will reach the level of an armed attack or use of force. That began to change around 2012. And then in 2014, NATO said, no, cyber could be a use of force or an armed attack. And so that's what the US was really hoping for, was a kind of more forward-leaning diplomatic discussion about what cyber could operate on, how we define the rules. I think on the defense side and actually on the offensive side, you're right. We don't necessarily, we're not encouraging them to go off and develop offensive capabilities. I think we expect our allies will do that. We'd like each NATO country to think about how they're going to use them, in particular for the defense of NATO. But other than that, we're not really getting involved. There's a lot of military to military discussions, but probably not sharing a lot on how you do that.
Right, right. What's your sense, if any, of the Trump administration's likely point of view on this? I mean, since you mentioned NATO, it's irresistible to not to turn to the Trump administration. Donald Trump was very critical of NATO allies as being essentially, to some degree, free riders on an American-dominated and economically system for NATO. I mean, the U.S. is paying too much, and he's tired of that. He made a number of other statements about cybersecurity issues, which, to my mind, don't necessarily add up to a lot yet. There was the famous reference to the was it 400-pound?
400-pound hacker in the bedroom.
In the bedroom, right.
On the bed, yeah.
Right, right. And there was a reference to, he'd asked Bill Gates to shut the internet down, which was, in my view, unfairly mocked, actually. I mean, it's hard not to mock it, but you know, as you know, I think we agree that the trend towards a greater national domination of the internet, or to more exclusive national domains on the internet, has been ongoing for a while, and in fact, turning off the internet is not quite as ridiculous a notion as one might like it to be. So, have you seen much to indicate where, you know, looking at these different tea leaves, where the Trump administration might go? Presumably a nationalist direction, since he's gone that way with everything else.
Yeah, and I think, look, one thing we know from American campaigns is campaigning is different than governing. And as you said, there was a lot of controversy over cyber, which we didn't expect in this election because of the DNC, the hacking by the Russians of the Democratic National Committee. Trump
and the assertion that it wasn't the Russians.
So Trump questioned the assertion that it was the Russians.
Community wasn't saying the right
exactly.
thing.
So Trump questioned that, and that's where the 400-pound hacker comes from. It only came up in one debate, and then the administration did release kind of a policy guidelines, which is pretty narrow. It talks about a review of all federal networks and where the vulnerabilities and security should do. A kind of commission that brings together all of the best practices on cyber and then spreads them out, and then greater development of offensive cyber capabilities. Those are really the only things that we've heard. The Republican National Platform had another point which was pretty interesting and controversial in the world of cyber policy, which is encouraging what's called active defense or hacking back, which is that the private sector is often the victims of nation-state attacks, right? The Chinese try to steal your intellectual property, or the North Koreans go after Sony. So should private companies be allowed to defend themselves? And the Republican National Committee says, yes, we should have some framework there for allowing that.
They should be able to defend themselves, or the government would be obliged to help them defend themselves?
The government should be able to defend the private companies should be able to defend themselves under some regulatory system. Like, you know, the example that's often used is the letters of marque, right, for how do you fight piracy, and so you would do the same thing in cyber.
I have thousands more questions, but Caleb from Florida, how do you see NATO's foreign policy changing to counter a growing cybersecurity environment? Growing cybersecurity, I'm guessing a more dangerous cybersecurity environment.
Well, I think what we've seen is similar to what we see in the kinetic world, right? Is so as they've seen more pressure from Russia, we see more NATO overflights, more NATO naval confrontations and patrols. We have prepositioning of forces now in the Baltic states. And so on the cyber side, we're seeing a lot more joint exercises. We're seeing a lot more discussion about how do you cooperate, because the NATO forces will defend NATO networks, but not in each individual country is then responsible for itself. So how do you coordinate that? And I suspect you will see, again, an attempt to demonstrate offensive capabilities to try to deter attack.
Without putting too fine a point on it, I think it's reasonable to say that one of the states that's of an unusually large concern to NATO is Russia.
Yeah.
I don't think I'm going out on a limb with that.
That's probably right.
And Russia has been associated with cyber attacks for a number of years now. Presumably, if I were, especially a so to speak, frontline state of NATO, I would be worrying about Russian cyber attacks, and the incident in Ukraine is a very good reason to pursue that kind of policy. So, given particularly that that candidate Trump talked a lot about alliance with Russia and others who were said to be entering his administrations, of not alliance, but about much closer relations, less conflictual relations with Russia and so forth. If I were particularly in a frontline state of NATO, I would be thinking to myself, my cyber systems are about to become a lot more vulnerable because I can't rely on the United States to sort of either protect them or just lend its intimidatory energy towards protecting them. I mean, that would be a calculation I think that I would make. Does that seem reasonable to you? And if it does, then what do I do? I mean, Estonia is ahead of the curve, but so what do I do if I'm Latvia and I'm not already ahead of the curve?
Yeah, I think probably any of those countries would have been naive to assume the U.S. could protect their networks anyway, right? Because we can't defend our own networks, right?
Fair enough.
We've consistently seen the U.S. can't keep out a dedicated, motivated attacker. So yes, if you're a Baltic state, you're going to think solely about it. I think you're right. Estonia is clearly ahead of the game thinking about it. They have lots of ideas and plans in action about how do you recreate the country almost like a government in exile. How do you create a digital government in exile? Right. So they've been talking about digital embassies abroad and using the cloud for pushing out critical digital things. So I think that a lot of countries will start thinking about that, and they're going to have to think a lot about resilience, right? What systems are in place to make sure that if the power grid goes down because of digital controls, do you have analog controls in there as well that you can start to rely on?
That's sort of like why we're training our sailors to use sextants again.
Exactly.
Kind of. Yeah. Question from Noel: does the U.S. have an effective cyber deterrent? I think the answer to that is no. What could make it stronger? It depends on what you mean by effective, obviously.
Right. So this is a big discussion right now. Do we have a deterrent, and what does an effective deterrent look like? And we clearly don't have a deterrent, right? Because North Korea, Iran, Russia, China all feel free to attack us or to conduct certain types of cyber operations. I would argue that we do have a limited deterrent in place, right? There have been no cyber attacks that cause widespread destruction and damage, right? So for all of you who saw Live Free or Die 4, and the hackers that blow things up and turn off the power grid, none of that has happened to the United States, and probably is very unlikely to happen because China and Russia, I think, are deterred from that. But everything below that is clearly not deterred. And it's very hard to figure out how you deter that, right? That's what we're struggling with right now. If Russia was behind the attacks on the DNC, that under traditional international law is not a use of force, an armed attack. That is interference with internal affairs. You're not going to fire a missile at Russia for that. you might do sanctions.
And you'd also hope that Russia wouldn't fire a missile at us for doing that.
Exactly. So it's very hard to figure out how do you deter. And there is always, the attribution question, right? So who is really behind the attack? And even you can see when the 17 intelligence agencies said, well, we think Russia is behind the attack, then they're much less certain about who ordered it. They say, well, we think Russian attackers are behind it. Excuse me. We think Russian attackers are behind it, but we are much less confident. We think it's high confidence that the Russian government ordered it, but we're much less confident about that. So again, how do you deter attackers there is much harder to do.
I want to take advantage of your China background. You mentioned earlier about hacking back and, to some extent the kind of debate around hacking back, which was around attacks on commercial interests by bodies that might or might not have government sponsorship. One of the few real bright spots was Xi Jinping and President Obama, President Xi Jinping of China and President Obama had an agreement that there would not be this kind of commercial aggression in cyberspace against each other. And some reports said that there was a significant, I think most reports said there was a measurable decline immediately after that. Whether it sort of has stuck or not is another question. And of course, with an incoming Trump administration, you have to wonder how much an agreement like that will really last past January 20th. I mean, how do you see, I guess, in particular, how do you see China's view of what it's trying to do, sort of short and medium, if not long term, in cyberspace, and how that agreement, whether that was just a tiny bump in, or something significant?
So I think most public evidence suggests that it's gone down and has stayed down, right? Both the commercial private companies, FireEye and CrowdStrike and others have said, yeah, we've seen the hacking go down, and the U.S. government has affirmed that. Does that mean that they've just gotten more focused on the targets and perhaps stealthier, right? Because Chinese hackers before were known as being kind of loud and pretty sloppy and got caught. So maybe they decided, you know what, smashing down every window wasn't really working for us, and let's focus narrowly and just take more important technology as opposed to everything. So that's a possibility. But let's just go with the assumption that it has gone down. Then I think there's kind of external reasons why it might have gone down and internal reasons. So the external reason is that the Obama administration basically was threatening to sanction the Chinese government, high-level Chinese officials and Chinese state-owned enterprises with trade sanctions. And they were doing it right before President Xi came to the United States for his first summit. So a very important time domestic politics-wise, because the Chinese want to wrap Xi Jinping in legitimacy as a statesman. So there were a lot of reasons why at that time the threat was useful and effective, and maybe won't be as effective, for Trump or others if it goes back up. But also the Chinese might have had their own reasons for pulling in the cyber hacking. One, they reorganized their military, and so they took a lot of cyber factors and they put it into what's called the strategic support forces, so they consolidated. And there's an anti-corruption campaign going on in China. So they may have decided, look, having all these people steal intellectual property, perhaps making money on the side, isn't the best use of state property, right? So given all of those factors, it could be that the commercial hacking is going to go down and stay down. But the Chinese are not going to stop hacking, right? They're going to still start hacking for political reasons. They're going to hack for espionage reasons, and all of that will continue.
Do you think, Carl's asking online, do you think that hacking back is a good approach?
Yeah, so I personally don't think hacking back is a very good idea. I think people have argued for it because it's clear the government can't defend the private sector, and the private sector has lots of capabilities, and so maybe we need to change the terrain somehow and empower the private sector to do more. And there is an interesting report that Carl should go look at that just came out of George Washington about we need to redefine, the debate shouldn't be between hacking back and doing nothing. This report argues, well, we need a kind of in-between middle space. that is tightly regulated and allows companies to do it. I'm particularly worried about the cost, which I think are going to be signaling and escalation control, right? Is that you could imagine that, let's say the U.S. and China have an incident in the South China Sea, right? And a Chinese naval vessel crashes into a U.S. naval vessel. We have some type of political standoff. And at that same time, some U.S. company decides, oh, you're stealing my intellectual property, and just tries to hack back into a Chinese company, and by accident takes out the power grid.
Right.
Then we have the situation.
Then you've got a casus belli, and you can't attribute it.
You can't attribute it, and you have a real escalatory problem. And so I'm already afraid that we have too many actors in this space. We don't understand each other's signaling. We can't control escalation. So to have companies come into it, for my purposes, the cost would be too high.
Although, you know, I mean, I don't want to find any consolations from history in terms of cyber, but at the same time, I mean, the U.S. and then not so far after other powers have been hacking each other's systems for 30 years, and pretty much.
Right.
And you know, I mean, DDoS attacks have been going on forever. These networks get penetrated. There must be some reason why none of that has actually amounted to, has not inspired an escalation of conflict.
Well, I think right now, because the attacks have not been that consequential, right? You know, we only have, you know, one reported incident where a cyber attack causes physical damage and destruction, right? That was the attack on Natanz and the Iranian centrifuges. And now we have this attack in December of 2015 of Russia on the Ukrainian power grid, which caused a, you know, a power outage of 4 to 5 hours.
There's the Shamoon attack too, but anyway.
Yeah, Shamoon was the damage from Iran to Saudi Aramco, but that was, you know, again, computer systems took them offline, business operations offline, but didn't cause physical damage. So I think that's right. I think so far it's been not very consequential on a kinetic outcome.
Right.
That could change over time, right? As we move towards the Internet of Things, right? More and more things connected to the Internet, more and more vulnerabilities. You know, we've seen people hack cars already. You could easily cause physical damage on that front. It could also be, you know, we could discover, right, when we discovered with the nuclear age, and once the archives were opened, that, oh, we thought it was very stable. We thought the Soviets understood our signaling, and we had a kind of mutual understanding about the uses and disabuses of nuclear weapons, but it turns out we didn't. We might have just gotten lucky.
Right, right. I'm Scott Malcomson at the Carnegie Corporation, talking with Adam Segal of Council on Foreign Relations about cybersecurity issues, and I encourage you to follow Adam on Twitter at ADS China, where he is an absolutely invaluable guide to these issues every single day. In terms of, let's just talk about internet governance for a little bit. It made a very brief appearance during the election campaign. And then disappeared. It's an issue that a technical community knows an enormous about, and that the public tends to know less about, and that governments sometimes know a lot about it, but no government really wants to talk about it. And it's the biggest recent development is that the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority, IANA, which had been operating under a contract with the U.S. Department of Commerce, a contract that had originated with the Department of Defense. That contract, it was agreed that that contract would end, and which was sort of cutting that last, you know, tangible tie between the United States as the sort of progenitor of the Internet and of the web. The last legal tie, and in place of it, there's now an unlovely, I think intentionally unlovely, set of players that usually are referred to as the Internet community, the global Internet community, plus governments. And essentially this is, you know, let's say roughly 10,000 people around the world who pay a lot of attention to the issues of how to resolve a call to a server and how the international system works. The Internet, of course, is basically in 3 layers. There's the physical layer of the root servers and the pipes, the backbone that connects them. The second layer being one of protocols and logic, so that a request for information from here results in the information actually appearing. And the third level, for the sake of argument, is a kind of content level. So it's no longer about the transmission, it's about the existence of content. The settlement, I guess you'd call it, with the internet community was that the middle layer, the protocol and logic layer, would be preserved as a kind of realm of the internet community itself, with governments as partners, but not able, at least we hope, to decisively shape that. And that means that information will be accessible everywhere. However, essentially the ground of content was ceded to states, so that if a government wants to censor or otherwise control or defend privacy or whatever it might be, good or bad, that power really is kind of increasingly in the hands of governments. Is that a fair characterization of where we're at now, and do you think that a new administration might approach that differently, or is it essentially that is the landscape that will be with us for some time?
No, I think that's the way we're moving, and I think your title of your book covers it well. I think we are moving towards a fragmented splinter net internet, right? One where national governments are going to exert more control over data, either for political reasons or economic reasons, and we're unlikely to see that change, right? We can just, in the last 6 months between Russia passing data localization laws, the Chinese talking about data localization in their cybersecurity law, questions about how you take down radical content from the internet in France, Germany, and the United States. There is going to be a lot more exertion of national authorities into cyberspace, and that is, I think, fundamentally over, as you said, over content. And the hope is that because there are so much economic gain to have from a global platform, that we can somehow keep those two separate.
And does that then lead to eventually to the Americanization of or so to speak, the relocalization of the great Silicon Valley companies? I mean, their business model has been based very much on global expansion. They are global companies. Facebook is a global company. Google is, Apple is, Microsoft is, Amazon is. In this process, does this affect the business model of those large companies?
I think the companies are desperately fighting to keep it as a global platform, right? They don't want to have to localize data in every market. They don't want to have to build a new product for every market, right? Because increasingly governments are saying we need backdoors into access for law enforcement purposes. So yes, I think they are desperately trying to fight that trend.
For very good reason. You don't want to have to say to somebody, you just traveled from across one border into another country, and they have a back door. You know what I mean? It's hard to see. It's a huge cost of business.
And the companies are going to have a very hard time saying, oh yeah, we give a back door to Russia and China, but we're not going to give it to the U.S. government.
Right.
So I think they're desperately fighting that. I think they're unlikely. They're going to make decisions based on markets, right? And so if you're Brazil or India or China or Russia and you have a big market, you have more power than Chile or Jordan. And so I think the companies are going to try to figure out how do you balance those two poles, because they've benefited immensely from this being a global platform.
So, but does that then lead to a situation where in local markets it would be more easy to innovate? In other words, if the Brazilian, to take a particularly ripe example, if the Brazilian government is able to turn its internet users into a captive market, will Brazilian companies then be able to take advantage of that and innovate? Alternatively, does it simply mean that there will be less innovation, so to speak, globally overall, because you're stuck with 193 different markets, and the scale that you need to innovate would be reduced because the market will be so much smaller than it was when Google was growing or Facebook was growing?
I think again it'll differ, right? So we know from the few studies that exist, for most markets, if you try to isolate yourself from the global platform, you lose GDP. Of course, the counterexample is China, right, where you close off the market, you hamper Google and Facebook, and then you get your own Baidu and Tencent and WeChat and other things. But most countries aren't China. So So China
Probably
has
no country's
yes.
China.
So I think Brazil wanted to be like China, but they don't necessarily have the science technology base and the entrepreneurship base and everything else like that.
Final question, Jack from Virginia. Do you have any advice on responding to attacks not involving escalation?
It's very easy to think about escalation. So it's actually also another very difficult question is what is a proportional response to a cyber attack? And so the U.S. has consistently said we will respond proportionally at a time and place of our choosing. So we often don't know when it's happened. I think, so for example, in the case of the North Korean attacks on Sony, we decided that sanctions on the North Korean intelligence units that were involved in the attack were a proportional response. You may remember that soon after the U.S. attribution of the attack to North Korea, the North Korean internet all went down. And so people said, well, that was the U.S. doing it. It wasn't. Some people said, well, that would be proportionate, right? They attacked us on the internet, we attacked them on the internet, but depriving an entire country is probably not proportionate.
Right.
I think it's going to depend entirely on the political circumstances and scenarios. It's clearly going to involve a mix of cyber and non-cyber attacks, but it is unclear about what proportion it is. Yeah.
Well, I hope this has been an adequate demonstration of the mastery of Adam Segal of this subject matter, and it's incredibly important going forward. And as you probably also gathered from the conversation, it's wide open, and so I hope we can somehow come up with rules and customs and ways of approaching this so that the internet doesn't become the splinter net that I wrote about, and my entire book will be proved wrong at some point, I hope. Thank you very much for being with us, and thanks, Adam, for taking the time.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for the questions.